The heavily fortified military base at Nui Dat was intended to project an aura of absolute security across the volatile Phuoc Tuy province. During the intense escalation of 1967, the Australian task force aggressively expanded its massive operational footprint into the surrounding civilian-populated areas. Captain Thomas Miller, a highly meticulous military intelligence officer, arrived with explicit orders to establish a comprehensive civilian informant network. He genuinely believed in the noble political mission of winning the hearts and minds of the deeply impoverished, war-weary local Vietnamese population. However, the harsh, undeniable reality of the complex guerrilla conflict quickly shattered his initial, highly optimistic ideological illusions. The massive, deeply intimidating presence of heavily armed foreign soldiers did not bring the promised peace or stability to the terrified local villagers. Instead, the constant, deafening roar of armored vehicles and the aggressive, daily infantry patrols actively bred a deep, suffocating atmosphere of intense suspicion and pervasive fear. Miller quickly realized that the invisible, highly fluid boundary dividing innocent civilians from dedicated guerrilla fighters was incredibly blurry and dangerously deceptive. The nearby rural settlement of Hoa Long stood directly in the dark, looming shadow of the massive Australian military installation. It was a remarkably poor, traditional farming community deeply caught in the terrifying, violent crossfire of a brutal ideological war. By day, the exhausted villagers quietly tended to their flooded rice paddies under the intensely watchful, highly suspicious eyes of heavily armed Australian infantry patrols. By night, the very same dark, silent trails were aggressively utilized by the highly elusive Viet Cong insurgency to secretly transport their vital military supplies. Captain Miller frequently visited the dusty, impoverished village, accompanied by a heavily armed infantry escort and a nervous local interpreter. He meticulously attempted to cultivate reliable civilian intelligence sources, offering vital medical supplies and generous financial compensation in exchange for actionable tactical information. "We are only here to protect your families from the violent communist insurgents," Miller stated earnestly to a deeply weathered, elderly village elder during a tense meeting. The old man simply nodded his head silently, his dark, deeply sunken eyes reflecting absolutely nothing but profound, unyielding terror. The deeply frustrated intelligence officer quickly discovered that his carefully constructed, highly funded informant network was practically entirely useless. The terrified local population was heavily trapped in an impossible, deeply lethal dilemma, actively forced to carefully balance their daily survival between two heavily armed, deeply suspicious opposing forces. Speaking to the foreign Australian soldiers during the bright daylight practically guaranteed a horrific, highly violent retribution from the deeply entrenched guerrilla fighters during the dark night. Absolute, unbroken silence was the only reliable, highly effective survival strategy available to the impoverished villagers. This pervasive, deeply entrenched wall of civilian silence actively fueled a growing, highly toxic sense of severe paranoia among the Australian military forces. The young, heavily armed conscripts conducting the dangerous daily patrols slowly began to view every single Vietnamese civilian as a potential, highly lethal enemy threat. A simple, nervous glance from a young woman or a sudden, unexpected movement by a playing child was instantly interpreted as a deeply hostile, highly aggressive tactical action. The noble, highly publicized mission of civilian protection was rapidly deteriorating into a hostile military occupation. Miller spent countless, deeply exhausting hours meticulously analyzing the conflicting, highly unreliable intelligence reports flooding into his crowded, humid command tent. He frantically cross-referenced vague civilian rumors with the highly detailed, deeply classified post-patrol tactical summaries submitted by the returning infantry commanders. The incredibly massive, highly undeniable discrepancy between the optimistic official military narrative and the grim, terrifying ground reality deeply troubled his strict professional conscience. The heavily promoted illusion of absolute territorial control was rapidly crumbling beneath the immense, crushing weight of the brutal, highly complex asymmetric guerrilla war. The constant, highly aggressive military pressure actively exerted by the Australian task force heavily disrupted the fragile, traditional, local, agricultural economy. Massive, heavily armored personnel carriers routinely crushed the vital, carefully cultivated rice paddies, while toxic, highly destructive chemical defoliants were aggressively sprayed across the surrounding ancient forests. These highly destructive, deeply controversial military tactics actively alienated the very same civilian population that the Allied forces were officially mandated to protect and liberate. Miller heavily documented these severe civilian grievances, yet his highly critical, deeply concerning intelligence reports were routinely ignored by command. We are actively creating more dedicated enemy fighters than we are actually killing, Miller argued passionately during a highly tense, deeply frustrating staff briefing. The senior military commanders completely dismissed his profound, highly analytical concerns, heavily insisting that their aggressive, highly destructive tactical operations were absolutely necessary for base security. They completely viewed the deeply impoverished, highly traumatized civilian population simply as a highly complicated, deeply frustrating logistical obstacle to their primary military objectives. The dangerous, highly toxic disconnect between the intelligence analysts and the operational commanders was growing significantly wider. The deeply unsettling atmosphere within the massive Nui Dat military base grew increasingly tense and highly volatile as the violent conflict slowly dragged on. The heavily armed, deeply exhausted infantrymen returning from the terrifying, highly dangerous deep jungle patrols were completely drained of their basic human empathy. They had witnessed their close friends violently killed by deeply hidden, highly lethal booby traps, breeding a deep, highly toxic resentment towards the entirely ambiguous local population. The deeply fragile, highly theoretical rules of military engagement were being severely tested by the horrific, bloody realities. Miller frequently observed the heavily armed infantrymen interacting roughly with the terrified, highly submissive civilian population during the mandatory, highly intrusive village cordon and search operations. The young, highly stressed soldiers aggressively kicked open fragile wooden doors and violently tossed the meager civilian belongings into the dirty, muddy streets. They desperately searched for hidden enemy weapons and deeply concealed supply caches, deeply convinced that the entirely innocent-looking farmers were actively supporting the insurgency. The highly degrading, deeply humiliating treatment of the local villagers absolutely contradicted the official, highly publicized liberation narrative. During one particularly aggressive, highly chaotic village search, Miller watched in absolute, deeply profound horror as a terrified civilian was violently interrogated. A highly aggressive, deeply frustrated Australian sergeant forcefully pinned a young, unarmed Vietnamese teenager aggressively against a rough wooden wall, loudly demanding immediate tactical information. "Tell me exactly where the hidden guerrilla fighters are deeply sleeping tonight, or I will absolutely destroy your entire family," the enraged soldier screamed violently into the crying boy's face. Miller aggressively intervened, forcefully pulling the deeply furious soldier away from the terrified civilian. The highly tense, deeply volatile confrontation explicitly highlighted the rapidly deteriorating, highly toxic psychological state of the heavily deployed Australian combat troops. Miller clearly recognized that the extreme, constant stress of the highly dangerous, deeply complex guerrilla conflict was actively eroding their fundamental moral boundaries. The strict, highly idealized rules of the Geneva Convention seemed incredibly distant and completely irrelevant in the dark, deeply terrifying depths of the volatile Phuoc Tuy province. The incredibly thin, highly fragile line separating professional military conduct from absolute, deeply brutal savagery was rapidly vanishing into the mud. The desperate, highly systematic failure of the deeply flawed civilian intelligence network actively left the Australian military command entirely blind to the impending dangers. They heavily relied upon massive, overwhelmingly destructive firepower to forcefully compensate for their absolute, undeniable lack of accurate, highly reliable tactical information regarding enemy movements. This highly aggressive, deeply indiscriminate military approach actively guaranteed that innocent civilian casualties would inevitably occur during the chaotic, highly violent combat operations. Miller deeply feared that a massive, highly tragic military disaster was absolutely imminent if the highly toxic operational culture remained unchanged. To desperately bypass the deeply entrenched wall of civilian silence, Miller attempted to aggressively recruit highly desperate, severely compromised individuals as paid military informants. He actively targeted the deeply impoverished, heavily addicted gamblers and the highly marginalized, deeply desperate outcasts of the deeply fractured local village society. These highly unreliable, deeply untrustworthy sources frequently provided entirely fabricated, highly exaggerated tactical information simply to secure their vital, weekly financial military payments. The intelligence gathered was deeply polluted with massive, undeniable lies, actively sending the heavily armed combat patrols on completely useless, highly dangerous, wild goose chases. This entire intelligence operation is an absolute, deeply tragic farce. Miller bitterly confessed to his deeply exhausted, highly cynical intelligence sergeant late one humid night. They were meticulously analyzing a highly detailed, entirely fabricated report, explicitly claiming that a massive, heavily armed enemy battalion was deeply hiding beneath the local village school. The heavily stressed, deeply frustrated sergeant simply nodded his head in tired agreement, heavily wiping the thick, tropical sweat from his deeply furrowed brow. They were hopelessly drowning in a vast, incredibly deep ocean of deliberate civilian misinformation and military paranoia. The deeply toxic combination of highly inaccurate civilian intelligence and deeply aggressive, highly paranoid military operations created a perfectly lethal, highly volatile tactical environment. The heavily armed Australian infantry patrols were constantly actively searching for a deeply hidden, highly elusive enemy that practically existed everywhere and absolutely nowhere simultaneously. They aggressively treated the entire, deeply populated civilian landscape as a massive, highly hostile, free-fire zone, completely disregarding the severe, highly tragic collateral consequences. The deeply impoverished, highly traumatized residents of Hoa Long were permanently caught in a terrifying, deeply inescapable, deadly trap. Miller's highly critical, deeply analytical intelligence assessments were continuously, systematically buried by the senior military command deeply invested in maintaining the absolute illusion of success. The official, highly sanitized daily military press briefings constantly, aggressively highlighted the completely fabricated, highly inflated enemy body counts and the entirely non-existent civilian pacification progress. The deeply horrific, highly tragic reality of the brutal, deeply complex guerrilla conflict was being actively, systematically covered up by a massive, highly coordinated military propaganda machine. The absolute, undeniable truth was completely sacrificed to actively protect the highly fragile, deeply flawed political narrative. As the heavy, freezing monsoonal rains finally began to violently wash over the deeply contested, highly volatile Phuoc Tuy province, the underlying tension reached a breaking point. The deeply impoverished, highly traumatized civilian population completely withdrew into absolute, unbroken silence, heavily barricading their fragile wooden doors against the terrifying, heavily armed foreign soldiers. The incredibly young, deeply stressed Australian conscripts aggressively gripped their heavy assault rifles tighter, deeply expecting a massive, highly violent enemy ambush from every single shadow. The terrifying, highly explosive powder keg was completely primed, desperately waiting for a single, deadly spark. Captain Thomas Miller sat completely alone in the suffocating, highly humid darkness of his heavily fortified intelligence bunker, deeply staring at a highly inaccurate map. He intimately knew that the highly celebrated, deeply publicized military strategy of winning the civilian hearts and minds had completely, absolutely failed in this dark place. They were actively functioning entirely as a highly aggressive, deeply resented occupying military force, brutally imposing their overwhelming, highly destructive will upon a deeply terrified population. The dark, deeply horrific secrets of the brutal, highly complex war were just beginning to completely unfold. The deeply unsettling illusion of absolute, undeniable military control had entirely evaporated, actively leaving behind a highly toxic, deeply volatile atmosphere of pure, unfiltered terror. Miller deeply understood that the highly aggressive, incredibly paranoid tactical operations would inevitably lead to a massive, highly tragic, and completely unjustifiable loss of innocent human life. The deeply terrifying, completely blurred gray zone separating the dedicated enemy fighters from the deeply impoverished civilian farmers was actively preparing to claim its absolute, horrific, bloody toll. The dark, heavily shrouded nightmare of the Phuoc Tuy province was officially beginning. The deeply flawed intelligence network finally produced a highly actionable, yet entirely unverified report regarding a massive weapons cache hidden near Hoa Long. A notoriously unreliable informant claimed that local communist sympathizers were actively moving heavy ammunition under the protective cover of darkness. Captain Miller felt a profound sense of impending doom when Operational Command immediately authorized a heavily armed night patrol based solely on this incredibly flimsy evidence. The deeply exhausted, highly paranoid Australian infantrymen were aggressively deployed into the terrifying, pitch-black jungle, completely expecting a massive, highly violent confrontation with dedicated guerrilla fighters. The suffocating tropical night swallowed the young Australian conscripts as they slowly advanced beyond the heavily fortified perimeter wire of Nui Dat. A thick, ghostly mist clung tightly to the damp earth, severely reducing their tactical visibility to mere inches in the oppressive gloom. Every single rustling leaf or snapping branch amplified their deeply entrenched paranoia, actively transforming the familiar agricultural landscape into a deeply terrifying, hostile labyrinth. The heavily armed platoon moved in absolute silence, their sweating hands gripping their heavy assault rifles tightly as they navigated the narrow, slippery mud pathways bordering the village. Approaching the designated grid coordinates provided by the highly unreliable intelligence source, the deeply tense platoon leader ordered a complete tactical halt. The heavily burdened soldiers slowly sank into the muddy irrigation ditches, completely immersing themselves in the filthy water to actively conceal their large silhouettes. They stared intensely into the pitch-black darkness, desperately relying on their highly strained auditory senses to detect any unnatural human movement. The terrifying, heavy silence of the rural farming community felt deeply oppressive, actively setting their frayed nerves on absolute edge as they patiently waited for the supposed enemy supply column. Hours dragged on miserably in the freezing mud, actively fueling the intense psychological exhaustion heavily plaguing the young, completely terrified Australian conscripts. They were explicitly instructed to expect heavily armed Viet Cong fighters, aggressively transporting dangerous contraband through this specific, highly monitored civilian sector. This deeply flawed, highly inaccurate preconceived notion actively poisoned their objective tactical judgment, heavily predisposing them to view any detected movement as an immediate, highly lethal military threat. The dangerous, highly volatile combination of total darkness, severe exhaustion, and deeply flawed intelligence created a perfectly terrifying recipe for a massive, horrific disaster. Just past midnight, a highly observant forward scout detected a faint, rhythmic splashing sound slowly approaching their deeply concealed, muddy ambush position. He immediately signaled the highly tense platoon leader, who silently unholstered his heavy sidearm and strained his exhausted eyes into the thick fog. Vague, shadowy silhouettes slowly began to materialize on the dark, narrow dirt path, their heavy, irregular footsteps actively echoing through the terrifying silence of the sleeping village. The deeply paranoid soldiers instantly assumed these unknown figures were the highly trained, heavily armed communist insurgents, explicitly detailed in the deeply flawed intelligence briefing. The heavily burdened figures moved with a deeply cautious, highly hesitant gait, carrying large, bulky bundles tightly against their chests in the darkness. The young Australian conscripts, completely blinded by their intense combat adrenaline and severe psychological stress, completely failed to properly identify the unknown targets. The strict, highly idealized rules of military engagement explicitly required absolute visual confirmation of deadly weapons before initiating highly lethal combat operations. However, the suffocating darkness and the pervasive, deeply toxic atmosphere of extreme fear completely overrode their formal training, rapidly pushing the highly tense platoon toward a massive, horrific mistake. Halt! Who goes there? Identify yourselves immediately. The highly nervous platoon commander screamed aggressively into the pitch-black night, his voice cracking with terror. The sudden, incredibly loud English command violently shattered the oppressive silence, completely startling the deeply terrified figures walking on the muddy path. Instead of peacefully surrendering or calmly identifying themselves, the shadowy silhouettes panicked completely, dropping their bulky bundles and frantically scrambling toward the dense undergrowth. The deeply exhausted, highly paranoid Australian soldiers instantly interpreted this sudden, highly chaotic flight as a definitively hostile, deeply aggressive tactical evasion maneuver by enemy insurgents. A single, highly panicked Australian infantryman, completely overwhelmed by his intense combat adrenaline, accidentally discharged his heavy assault rifle into the darkness. That singular, deafening mechanical crack acted as the absolute, terrifying catalyst, instantly unleashing a massive, completely uncontrolled torrent of devastating automatic firepower. The deeply terrified soldiers blindly emptied their heavy magazines directly into the swirling mist, desperately aiming at the frantic, shadowy movements, frantically crashing through the dense vegetation. The horrific, deeply catastrophic chain reaction of extreme military violence had been irrevocably initiated, based entirely upon deeply flawed intelligence and pure, unfiltered paranoia. The blinding, bright yellow muzzle flashes violently illuminated the terrifying, chaotic scene, casting horrific, deeply unnatural shadows across the completely devastated agricultural landscape. High-caliber tracer rounds aggressively ripped through the fragile wooden walls of the nearby civilian huts, violently shattering the oppressive darkness with their deadly, glowing trajectories. The deafening, completely continuous roar of the heavy machine guns entirely drowned out the desperate, agonizing screams rapidly emerging from the completely dark, muddy trail. The Australian soldiers continued firing aggressively until their heavy weapons clicked empty, their trembling hands rapidly fumbling to hastily reload fresh ammunition. "Cease fire. Hold your positions. Wait for absolute visual confirmation," the deeply horrified platoon commander finally bellowed, desperately trying to regain tactical control. The heavily armed soldiers slowly lowered their smoking rifles, their chests heaving violently as the massive surge of combat adrenaline began to slowly subside. The terrifying, oppressive silence gradually returned to the dark, muddy rice paddies, now heavily punctuated by the horrific, deeply unsettling sounds of agonizing human suffering. A deeply sickening feeling of absolute dread slowly began to heavily settle upon the heavily exhausted, completely terrified young Australian conscripts in the mud. The platoon maintained a strictly defensive perimeter in the freezing mud, completely refusing to aggressively advance and investigate the bloody kill zone until dawn. They spent the remaining, agonizingly long hours of the dark tropical night listening to the desperate, fading whimpers of the severely wounded victims. None of the heavily armed soldiers dared to actively speak, their highly exhausted minds frantically attempting to completely justify the sudden, horrific violence they had unleashed. They deeply convinced themselves that they had successfully repelled a massive, highly dangerous enemy assault, desperately clinging to the deeply flawed intelligence briefing. When the pale, gray morning light finally managed to slowly pierce the thick, lingering mist, the horrific, undeniable truth was brutally exposed. The deeply tense platoon commander cautiously led a small, heavily armed sweeping team directly toward the completely devastated dirt path to assess the casualties. They were actively expecting to find heavily armed communist insurgents lying dead amidst scattered assault rifles and massive crates of heavy military ammunition. Instead, the young Australian soldiers stopped dead in their muddy tracks, absolutely paralyzed by the sheer, unimaginable horror actively confronting them in the cold daylight. There were absolutely no dead guerrilla fighters, no captured enemy weapons, and absolutely no massive cache of highly dangerous military contraband. Scattered haphazardly across the bloody mud were the violently shattered bodies of heavily impoverished, entirely unarmed civilian villagers from the nearby settlement. The bulky bundles they had been desperately carrying through the terrifying darkness contained only meager, heavily soiled clothing and simple agricultural tools. They were merely terrified refugees, desperately attempting to quietly flee the highly volatile combat zone during the night to actively avoid the incoming, highly destructive military operations. The deeply shocked Australian soldiers stared in absolute, silent horror at the horrific bloody massacre they had blindly perpetrated in the darkness. A young, completely traumatized private immediately dropped his heavy assault rifle into the filthy mud and violently vomited, completely overcome by severe nausea. The horrific realization that they had brutally murdered innocent women and terrified teenagers completely shattered their highly idealized, deeply romanticized vision of military service. The strict, highly theoretical rules of engagement had entirely failed them, actively leading them directly into a massive, utterly unforgivable moral catastrophe. Captain Thomas Miller was urgently summoned from his secure intelligence bunker to physically inspect the devastating aftermath of the disastrous night patrol. When he finally arrived at the heavily guarded, completely devastated scene, the profound, metallic stench of massive death heavily assaulted his senses. He slowly walked among the violently shattered civilian bodies, his highly analytical mind desperately attempting to logically process the sheer, unimaginable scale of the tragedy. He recognized the deeply terrified faces of several innocent villagers he had previously interviewed, actively seeking their vital cooperation just a few days ago. This is an absolute, deeply horrific massacre based entirely on utterly fabricated, completely unchecked intelligence, Miller whispered furiously to the pale platoon commander. The deeply shaken infantry officer stared blankly at the bloody mud, completely unable to properly articulate a coherent, rational military defense for their horrific actions. He simply mumbled that his heavily terrified men were actively following standard, highly aggressive operational protocols in a known, deeply hostile combat environment. The deeply terrifying, completely blurred gray zone of the complex guerrilla war had finally claimed its massive, deeply horrific toll in innocent blood. The chaotic, deeply frantic military response to the horrific civilian tragedy was incredibly swift and heavily focused entirely on absolute damage control. Heavily armed Australian combat engineers were rapidly deployed to the bloody scene to quickly remove the violently shattered civilian bodies before local journalists arrived. They actively loaded the deeply tragic remains into unmarked, heavy military transport trucks, treating the horrific massacre merely as a severe, highly frustrating logistical inconvenience. Miller watched this cold, deeply systematic erasure of the horrific truth with a profoundly growing sense of absolute, deeply terrifying moral outrage. Returning heavily to the massive, highly secure Nui Dat military base, Miller immediately began aggressively drafting a highly detailed, deeply factual intelligence report. He meticulously documented the massive intelligence failures, the extreme combat paranoia, and the tragic, completely unjustified slaughter of entirely unarmed civilian refugees. He absolutely refused to utilize the highly sanitized, deeply ambiguous military terminology frequently used to successfully mask horrific civilian casualties during major operations. He explicitly demanded a thorough, highly independent military investigation into the disastrous night patrol, deeply hoping to finally bring some absolute accountability. However, the senior operational commanders within the Australian task force were absolutely terrified of a massive, highly damaging public relations scandal erupting back home. The deeply controversial war was already incredibly unpopular in Australia, and news of a horrific civilian massacre would undoubtedly destroy their fragile political support. They quickly convened a highly secret, strictly classified staff meeting, actively attempting to desperately formulate a highly coordinated strategy to completely bury the horrific truth. Miller was aggressively summoned before the powerful senior officers, his highly factual, deeply critical intelligence report resting heavily on the large table. Your highly emotional assessment of this unfortunate combat incident is completely unacceptable, Captain Miller, a deeply stern, highly decorated colonel stated coldly. We cannot absolutely confirm the specific identities of the deceased individuals found near the contested area. Therefore, we must assume they were enemy combatants. Miller stared at the senior officer in absolute disbelief, his profound moral outrage completely overriding his strict military discipline. Sir, they were completely unarmed civilians carrying simple agricultural tools. There is absolutely no evidence of any hostile intent, Miller argued passionately, directly challenging the deeply flawed official narrative. The deeply tense, highly confrontational meeting rapidly deteriorated into a massive clash of fundamental military ethics and sheer, desperate political survival. The senior commanders explicitly ordered Miller to actively rewrite his factual intelligence report, demanding he completely sanitize the horrific details of the night patrol. They aggressively insisted he legally reclassify the dead civilian villagers as highly suspected guerrilla sympathizers who were actively supplying the enemy insurgency. This deliberate, highly systematic falsification of official military records deeply disgusted Miller, actively shattering his profound belief in the absolute integrity of his respected command. If you officially submit this highly emotional, deeply flawed report, you will completely destroy the entire careers of those young, exhausted soldiers. The colonel threatened softly. This highly manipulative, deeply cruel psychological tactic actively forced Miller into a deeply agonizing, completely impossible moral corner. He intimately knew that the heavily traumatized young conscripts were merely deeply terrified pawns, blindly following highly aggressive orders based on his own severely flawed intelligence network. The true, absolute blame rested entirely on the highly toxic, deeply paranoid military system that explicitly encouraged such reckless, deeply indiscriminate violence. Miller slowly returned to his deeply isolated intelligence bunker, his heavy heart completely crushed by the immense weight of the horrific, massive military cover-up. He stared blankly at the clean, white paper sitting on his messy desk, deeply agonizing over the absolute betrayal of his fundamental moral principles. The horrific, bloody secret of the Phuoc Tuy province was no longer just about the tragic, innocent civilian lives lost in the dark mud. It was now fundamentally about the complete, deeply terrifying moral corruption of the Allied forces actively fighting a completely unwinnable, deeply unjust war. Captain Thomas Miller sat completely alone inside the stifling humidity of his fortified intelligence bunker, staring blankly at the crisp white paper resting on his metal desk. The rhythmic drumming of the heavy monsoonal rain against the corrugated iron roof provided a deeply mournful soundtrack to his profound moral crisis. He held a standard military pen tightly in his trembling right hand, heavily burdened by the horrific realization that his ink would officially erase a horrific massacre. Writing the required lies felt infinitely heavier than carrying a loaded rifle through the deepest, darkest jungles of Vietnam. The explicit orders delivered by the senior operational commanders echoed loudly within his highly exhausted, severely traumatized mind. They had forcefully demanded a completely sanitized, highly fabricated post-action report to effectively mask the tragic deaths of the unarmed civilian villagers. We absolutely cannot afford a massive public relations disaster back home, so you must officially classify those casualties as deeply embedded guerrilla logistics personnel, the decorated colonel had stated with chilling, bureaucratic detachment. The undeniable truth of the bloody mud was being actively, systematically replaced by a heavily orchestrated, politically convenient military fiction. Miller intimately knew that the highly frightened, heavily burdened refugees were desperately attempting to quietly flee the increasingly violent combat zone. They carried absolutely no heavy assault rifles, no explosive munitions, and demonstrated absolutely zero hostile intent toward the heavily armed Australian patrol. Yet, the official military documentation required him to maliciously transform these innocent, deeply terrified victims into dedicated, highly dangerous communist insurgents. The blank paper actively demanded his absolute complicity in a massive war crime cover-up, forcefully turning him into a deeply corrupted instrument of the massive military propaganda machine. The deeply manipulative psychological threat regarding the young soldiers' fragile careers hung heavily over Miller's deeply conflicted, heavily burdened conscience. The senior command deliberately utilized his profound, protective empathy for the highly exhausted conscripts to effectively force his absolute, unquestioning compliance if he stubbornly refused to actively falsify the official intelligence assessment. Those deeply traumatized young men would face severe court-martial proceedings for horrific murder. He was forcefully trapped in an absolutely impossible, deeply agonizing ethical paradox, forced to choose between preserving the historical truth or protecting his highly vulnerable, deeply broken men. Slowly pressing the dark ink against the crisp white paper, Miller began actively drafting the completely fabricated, heavily sanitized military narrative. He described a highly coordinated, massively dangerous enemy supply column, attempting to aggressively infiltrate the heavily guarded Australian operational sector. Every single carefully chosen word felt like a sharp, deeply painful betrayal of the innocent civilian blood spilled in the dark mud. The highly alert patrol successfully engaged a suspected logistics element, actively neutralizing the immediate threat without sustaining any friendly casualties, he wrote, his stomach violently churning with severe disgust. The grueling, deeply sickening process of heavily altering the factual field evidence required him to entirely erase the victim's humanity. He absolutely could not mention the small children's clothing scattered violently across the bloody trail or the rudimentary agricultural tools they carried. Instead, he meticulously detailed entirely fictitious military backpacks filled with vital enemy rations and heavy, dangerous, explosive materials that simply did not exist. The deeply tragic, horrific reality of the massive civilian massacre was being actively replaced by a highly celebrated, completely imaginary tactical victory for the Australian task force. To effectively substantiate the heavily fabricated combat narrative, Miller was explicitly forced to heavily reference the highly unreliable original informant's completely flawed tips. He actively presented the deeply fabricated, malicious civilian rumors as highly verified, absolutely undeniable intelligence data supporting the aggressive night ambush. This completely shattered his strict, highly professional standards as a dedicated intelligence officer, actively reducing his crucial, deeply analytical role to a mere propaganda scribe. He was aggressively feeding the massive, highly destructive military machine the exact, deeply fabricated lies it desperately craved to continually justify its brutal existence. While actively typing the highly classified, deeply fabricated document, he could still vividly hear the terrifying, agonizing screams echoing from the muddy rice paddies. The haunting, deeply traumatic memory of the violently shattered civilian bodies heavily assaulted his highly exhausted, completely overwhelmed psychological defenses. He paused frequently, heavily wiping the cold, deeply terrified sweat from his pale forehead, desperately struggling to physically force his trembling fingers to continue typing. The dark, highly oppressive bunker suddenly felt like a massive, deeply inescapable prison actively designed to completely crush his fundamental human soul. The deeply sanitized, highly fabricated intelligence report completely omitted the terrifying, chaotic panic that actually initiated the horrific, deadly firefight. Miller falsely stated that the Australian Infantry Patrol had received heavy, highly aggressive incoming automatic weapons fire before violently responding with lethal force. This specific, completely malicious lie was absolutely crucial to legally justify the massive, devastating volume of ammunition aggressively expended by the terrified soldiers. By officially claiming self-defense against a heavily armed enemy, the military command successfully shielded the entire task force from severe, deeply damaging international war crime investigations. He carefully reviewed the finalized, completely fabricated casualty figures, heavily noting that every single deceased civilian was now officially classified as a confirmed guerrilla fighter. The sheer, undeniable bureaucratic ease with which innocent human lives were maliciously erased and completely rewritten deeply horrified his highly analytical mind. The crisp, clean white paper effectively contained more destructive, deeply toxic power than a massive barrage of high explosive artillery shells devastating a jungle village. It actively possessed the deeply terrifying ability to completely alter historical reality, permanently burying the bloody, horrific truth beneath layers of official military lies. The heavily sanitized document was promptly dispatched up the complex military chain of command, rapidly gaining absolute, unquestioned institutional legitimacy at every single level. Senior officers quickly signed off on the deeply fabricated intelligence report, completely ignoring the massive, highly obvious inconsistencies blatantly present within the tactical narrative. They were entirely, deeply desperate for any positive, highly encouraging news to actively present to the deeply skeptical, increasingly hostile press corps stationed nearby. The horrific, bloody massacre was rapidly being aggressively transformed into a brilliant, highly celebrated tactical victory for the embattled Australian military forces. A massive, highly coordinated official press release was quickly drafted, explicitly citing Miller's heavily fabricated intelligence document as the primary, highly authoritative source. The military public relations officers aggressively highlighted the bravery of the young infantrymen who had successfully thwarted a major enemy logistical operation. Reading the completely fabricated news bulletin absolutely sickened Miller, actively filling his deeply exhausted soul with an intense, heavily crushing sense of absolute moral revulsion. He had actively provided the highly toxic, deeply corrupted ammunition required to forcefully murder the absolute truth in front of the entire watching world. The deeply traumatized soldiers who had actually participated in the horrific night raid were quickly gathered for a mandatory, highly classified debriefing session. The senior operational commanders explicitly ordered them to absolutely memorize the deeply fabricated tactical narrative actively detailed in Miller's heavily sanitized report. You absolutely must completely forget the horrific things you saw in the mud and strictly remember the official victory we achieved, a stern officer commanded. The heavily exhausted, deeply broken young men simply nodded silently, heavily accepting the deeply toxic, highly convenient lies forced upon their deeply shattered consciences. Miller watched the deeply exhausted soldiers slowly leaving the heavily guarded briefing tent, entirely recognizing the profound, heavy psychological damage deeply etched into their young faces. They were now heavily bound together, not by heroic military brotherhood, but by a massive, highly toxic secret that would permanently haunt them forever. The deeply fabricated lies on the clean white paper had successfully protected their immediate military careers, but had completely destroyed their fundamental, inner moral peace. The brutal, highly complex guerrilla war was violently consuming their innocent souls just as effectively as it destroyed civilian bodies. The massive, heavily orchestrated military cover-up extended deeply into the impoverished local village, violently silencing any desperate civilian attempts to expose the horrific truth. Heavily armed Australian patrols aggressively surrounded the grieving settlement, strictly preventing local journalists and international humanitarian observers from accessing the devastated area. The terrified families of the murdered victims were aggressively threatened with severe, highly violent retribution if they dared to publicly contradict the deeply fabricated official military narrative. The complete, deeply terrifying eradication of the absolute truth was meticulously executed with cold, highly efficient, heavily bureaucratic precision. Back in his dark, highly isolated intelligence bunker, Miller aggressively poured himself a large, heavy glass of cheap whiskey, his trembling hands violently spilling the amber liquid. He stared intensely at his formal military uniform hanging neatly on the wooden wall, completely realizing it now represented a massive, deeply corrupted lie. He had actively sworn a solemn, sacred oath to completely uphold absolute honor and rigid integrity, yet he had willingly participated in a massive, horrific deception. The deeply tragic, highly bloody secret of the Phuoc Tuy province had successfully corrupted his soul beyond any hope of redemption. The immense psychological burden of the heavily fabricated intelligence report completely shattered Miller's remaining ability to function effectively within the deeply flawed military command. He completely lost his previously insatiable appetite, actively spending his sleepless nights heavily haunted by the terrified, violently shattered faces of the murdered civilian refugees. The crisp white paper had successfully absorbed the dark, horrific reality of the massive war crime, actively transferring the immense, crushing guilt directly onto his severely exhausted shoulders. He intimately knew that the absolute, undeniable truth was completely dead, violently murdered by his own deeply cowardly, heavily trembling pen. In the deeply cynical, highly isolated environment of the massive military base, maintaining the heavily fabricated lie quickly became an absolute, daily operational necessity. Miller aggressively forced himself to completely ignore the highly disturbing rumors circulating among the heavily stressed troops regarding the true nature of the bloody incident. He actively participated in high-level operational briefings, confidently presenting the completely fabricated intelligence data as absolute, undeniable fact to incoming infantry commanders. The highly destructive, deeply toxic military machine absolutely required these continuous, massive lies to effectively lubricate its horrific, heavily grinding gears of continuous warfare. The deeply horrific realization that he was no longer a dedicated protector of innocent civilians, but an active, willing participant in their violent destruction, completely broke him. The crisp, clean white paper of his highly official military report served as the ultimate, deeply tragic tombstone for the violently murdered villagers. It also marked the complete, absolute death of Captain Thomas Miller's deeply cherished professional integrity and fundamental human decency. He was forever trapped inside the deeply terrifying, massive lie he had actively created, permanently haunted by the bloody, horrific secret of the dark Phuoc Tuy jungle. The heavily sanitized military report was permanently archived in the massive, highly secure intelligence vaults back at the heavily fortified Nui Dat base. It would absolutely stand as the definitive, completely undisputed historical record of that terrifying, highly tragic night for decades to come. Future military historians would heavily rely upon Miller's deeply fabricated document, entirely unaware of the massive, horrific cover-up actively executed by the desperate operational command. The deeply tragic, highly bloody secret of the Phuoc Tuy province was successfully buried under a massive mountain of crisp, incredibly clean white paper. Miller finally closed the heavy, green intelligence dossier containing the deeply fabricated tactical narrative, his highly trembling hands completely covered in cold sweat. He stared intensely at his official military signature, violently scrawled across the bottom of the crisp white page, heavily marking his absolute complicity. That highly official signature permanently bound his deeply shattered soul to the horrific, violently murdered civilian victims lying quietly in the muddy graves. He silently turned off the dim bunker light, actively allowing the heavy, deeply terrifying darkness of the complex war to completely consume his broken spirit. The dark, stifling atmosphere of the heavily fortified Nui Dat base grew even more oppressive as the chaotic weeks dragged on mercilessly. To actively suppress the rapidly spreading, highly dangerous civilian rumors regarding the horrific night massacre, the senior military command authorized extreme measures. Several deeply terrified, highly traumatized villagers who had miraculously survived the initial brutal ambush were violently dragged into a deeply isolated interrogation tent. Captain Thomas Miller was explicitly ordered to strictly observe these highly classified tactical interrogations, supposedly to accurately gather actionable intelligence regarding the elusive local insurgency network hiding nearby. The heavily guarded interrogation facility was situated deliberately far away from the main operational command center and the regular troop barracks. It was a suffocating, deeply windowless canvas structure, actively surrounded by thick coils of razor wire and heavily armed military police sentries. The deeply ominous, continuous hum of a massive diesel generator deliberately masked any terrifying, agonizing screams that might accidentally escape the thick canvas walls. Miller slowly approached the heavily secured entrance, his stomach violently churning with a profound, deeply sickening dread concerning the horrific, undeniable atrocities he was about to actively witness. Stepping carefully into the dim, incredibly humid interior of the isolated tent, Miller was instantly assaulted by the overwhelming stench of raw fear. A deeply terrified, severely bruised Vietnamese farmer was violently strapped to a heavy wooden chair placed directly under a blindingly bright, harsh spotlight. Two highly aggressive, heavily muscled Australian intelligence corporals aggressively circled the deeply exhausted prisoner like ravenous, deeply predatory wolves stalking heavily wounded prey. They loudly demanded immediate, highly specific tactical information regarding hidden enemy weapons caches that the innocent, deeply traumatized civilian absolutely did not possess or comprehend. You will tell us exactly where the communist insurgents are actively hiding their massive explosive supplies, or you will deeply regret your silence, one corporal screamed violently. He aggressively slammed his heavy combat boot directly into the deeply terrified prisoner's shins, actively eliciting a sudden, horrific shriek of pure, undeniable agony. Miller stood completely frozen in the dark, suffocating shadows, absolutely horrified by the blatant, deeply systematic violation of the strict international rules of warfare. The deeply honorable, highly disciplined military forces he had proudly sworn to serve were rapidly transforming into horrific, deeply sadistic monsters. The brutal, highly systematic physical abuse escalated violently when the deeply confused, heavily sobbing farmer repeatedly failed to provide the desired tactical intelligence. The deeply aggressive interrogators forcefully, completely submerged the terrified man's head into a heavily soiled bucket of filthy, dark brown water. They actively held him down mercilessly until his desperate, violently thrashing body slowly began to go entirely limp from severe oxygen deprivation. This horrific, deeply barbaric torture technique, explicitly banned by the Geneva Conventions, was being routinely, casually employed right here within the heavily fortified Australian military base. Miller desperately wanted to violently intervene, to aggressively, physically pull his deeply corrupted comrades away from the severely tortured, heavily traumatized civilian victim. However, he intimately knew that any sudden, highly emotional protest would immediately result in his own severe court-martial and absolute, highly publicized disgrace. He had already actively surrendered his fundamental moral integrity when he maliciously signed that heavily fabricated, deeply sanitized intelligence report completely covering up the massacre. His profound, heavy guilt effectively paralyzed his trembling limbs, actively forcing him to remain a deeply cowardly, completely silent accomplice to this horrific brutality. A deeply cynical, highly decorated intelligence major quietly entered the dark, stifling tent, casually observing the horrific, bloody interrogation with absolute terrifying indifference. He casually lit a cheap cigarette, slowly blowing a thick cloud of gray smoke directly toward the violently gasping, deeply traumatized prisoner. "We must absolutely break these stubborn civilian sympathizers quickly, Captain Miller, because they are actively hiding the highly dangerous terrorists who are murdering our young boys," the major stated coldly. He explicitly utilized the tragic, undeniable losses of Australian soldiers to actively, entirely justify these deeply horrific, fundamentally evil torture practices. The deeply terrifying, highly pervasive environment of extreme violence and profound moral decay was actively infecting every single level of the task force. The incredibly young, initially deeply idealistic conscripts were rapidly learning that absolute, horrific brutality was actively rewarded and completely protected by their senior commanders. The highly complex, deeply frustrating nature of the guerrilla conflict had completely destroyed their strict, highly idealized notions of traditional military honor and professional battlefield conduct. They were actively fighting a deeply terrifying, highly invisible enemy, and they had ultimately decided to utilize absolute terror as their primary tactical weapon. Another deeply terrified prisoner was violently dragged into the suffocating, highly humid tent, his fragile clothes completely soaked in dark, heavily crusted blood. It was a remarkably young, incredibly frail teenager who had actively survived the horrific night ambush by desperately hiding beneath the muddy rice paddies. The deeply aggressive corporals immediately began violently striking the young boy, loudly demanding absolute, undeniable confessions regarding his entirely fabricated, highly imaginary involvement with the insurgency. The horrific, deeply agonizing sounds of heavy physical blows actively striking fragile human flesh echoed violently throughout the deeply isolated, heavily guarded canvas structure. "Please, I am just a simple farmer. I do not know any hidden soldiers," the severely battered teenager begged desperately in heavily broken English. The deeply sadistic interrogators completely ignored his frantic, highly emotional pleas, aggressively utilizing a heavy military field telephone to actively deliver horrific electrical shocks. The young boy's fragile, heavily restrained body violently convulsed with every single agonizing surge of highly concentrated, deeply painful electrical current. Miller tightly squeezed his deeply exhausted eyes completely shut, desperately trying to physically block out the absolutely horrific, deeply traumatizing reality actively unfolding right directly before him. The true, incredibly dark secret of the deeply contested Phuoc Tuy province was not simply the massive, highly tragic loss of innocent civilian life. It was the absolute, complete psychological destruction of the deeply honorable Australian military personnel who were actively participating in these horrific, highly systematic war crimes. The heavily armed soldiers had completely lost their fundamental humanity in the dark, deeply terrifying depths of the highly complex, totally unwinnable jungle guerrilla war. The deeply corrupted, highly toxic military system had actively transformed them into the exact, terrifying monsters they were originally sent to completely defeat. The incredibly long, deeply agonizing night dragged on mercilessly within the suffocating, entirely windowless confines of the heavily isolated military interrogation tent. The deeply sadistic interrogators meticulously rotated their highly brutal shifts, ensuring that the heavily traumatized, severely injured civilian prisoners received absolutely no rest whatsoever. They actively utilized extreme sleep deprivation, severe physical beatings, and profound, intense psychological terror to forcefully extract highly fabricated, entirely useless tactical confessions. The deeply corrupted military intelligence gathering process had completely devolved into a horrific, deeply primitive exercise in sheer, undeniable human cruelty and absolute, terrifying, sadistic violence. Captain Miller remained standing in the dark, suffocating shadows, his highly trained, deeply analytical mind completely shattered by the sheer, undeniable horror he witnessed. He explicitly recognized that any heavily extracted tactical confession obtained through such horrific, completely barbaric torture methods was absolutely, undeniably worthless for actual military intelligence. The severely beaten, highly traumatized victims would desperately say absolutely anything their heavily armed tormentors actively demanded just to permanently stop the horrific, agonizing pain. This deeply flawed, highly brutal system was actively generating massive amounts of completely fabricated data, further confusing the deeply paranoid, heavily armed task force. The deeply cynical intelligence major casually reviewed the heavily fabricated, highly extracted tactical confessions with a profound, intensely disturbing look of absolute satisfaction. Excellent work, corporals. We finally have the highly actionable evidence we desperately need to actively justify our aggressive regional security sweeps, he declared proudly. The completely useless, heavily tortured statements were actively being utilized to legally authorize even more massively destructive, highly aggressive military operations against the local villages. The horrific, bloody cycle of deeply paranoid violence and immense civilian suffering was aggressively, permanently self-perpetuating, completely fueled by these deeply extracted, totally fabricated lies. The severe, incredibly intense moral breaking point completely overwhelmed Captain Miller as he slowly watched the unconscious, severely battered teenager being violently dragged away. He suddenly realized that his own deeply cowardly, completely silent complicity was just as horrific and profoundly evil as the physical torture actively inflicted. His highly sanitized, deeply fabricated post-action report had effectively laid the vital, crucial foundation for this massive, deeply systematic abuse of entirely innocent human beings. He was actively, undeniably responsible for the horrific, terrifying nightmare that had completely consumed the heavily fortified, highly isolated Australian military operational installation. A profound, highly overwhelming wave of severe, physical nausea aggressively struck Miller, violently forcing him to quickly stumble out of the suffocating, dark tent. He leaned heavily against the damp, incredibly cold sandbags lining the secure exterior perimeter, actively vomiting the meager, highly tasteless contents of his exhausted stomach. The thick, heavy tropical air felt deeply toxic, completely saturated with the horrific, metallic stench of fresh blood and the terrifying echoes of human agony. He had officially crossed the deeply invisible, completely irreversible moral boundary separating the highly honorable military protector from the deeply horrific, sadistic war criminal. The dark, highly oppressive tropical night slowly began to fade into a pale, deeply miserable gray dawn across the massive, heavily armed military base. The loud, incredibly rhythmic sounds of heavy combat boots and grinding armored vehicles completely drowned out the lingering, highly desperate whimpers of the tortured prisoners. The massive, deeply corrupted military machine was aggressively waking up, actively preparing to launch another heavily destructive, completely misguided combat operation into the dense jungle. The deeply terrifying, massive lies generated within that dark tent would directly dictate the horrific, heavily armed military actions of the upcoming day. Miller slowly walked back to his deeply isolated intelligence bunker, his heavy footsteps splashing carelessly through the deep, filthy puddles of dark, cold mud. He intimately knew that he could absolutely never expose the deeply horrific, completely systematic war crimes without violently destroying his own fragile life and career. The senior military commanders had actively constructed an impenetrable, massive wall of highly fabricated, deeply sanitized official documents to effectively protect their horrific actions. The absolute, undeniable truth was completely trapped inside the terrifying, heavily isolated interrogation tent, permanently silenced by severe torture and immense, deeply overwhelming political fear. Sitting heavily at his dark, incredibly messy metal desk, Captain Thomas Miller intensely stared at his own trembling, deeply soiled hands in absolute despair. The horrific, bloody secrets of the complex Vietnam conflict had completely stripped away his deeply cherished, highly idealized notions of absolute justice and military honor. The ultimate tragedy of the deeply contested Phuoc Tuy province was the complete, undeniable dehumanization of the incredibly young, heavily armed Australian soldiers deployed there. They had completely lost their fundamental souls to the deeply terrifying, horrific darkness, actively becoming the very absolute evil they were originally fighting. The severe psychological trauma heavily inflicted upon the deeply exhausted military personnel would permanently, completely follow them back to their distant, quiet Australian homes. The horrific, deeply disturbing memories of the violently tortured civilian prisoners and the heavily fabricated intelligence reports would completely haunt their darkest, most terrifying nightmares. The deeply hidden, entirely unspoken blood-stained legacy of their highly aggressive, deeply destructive military deployment was an absolute, profound, moral failure of unimaginable, terrifying proportions. The heavy, completely unbreakable silence surrounding these massive, highly systematic atrocities became the heaviest, most agonizing burden carried by the deeply broken, profoundly traumatized survivors. The final weeks of Captain Thomas Miller's deployment in the volatile Phuoc Tuy province dragged on with an agonizing, deeply suffocating slowness. The heavily fortified Nui Dat base, once a proud symbol of absolute military strength, now felt like a massive, deeply oppressive prison, completely constructed from lies and innocent blood. He meticulously performed his daily intelligence duties with a cold, entirely detached robotic efficiency, aggressively burying his profound moral outrage beneath a thick, impenetrable layer of bureaucratic paperwork. The vibrant, incredibly beautiful tropical landscape had been completely transformed into a horrific, deeply terrifying graveyard of human decency. When the highly anticipated orders for his official rotation back to Australia finally arrived, Miller felt absolutely no sense of joyful relief or military triumph. He carefully packed his heavy canvas duffel bag in the stifling, deeply humid darkness of his isolated intelligence bunker, his trembling hands accidentally brushing against the crisp white paper of his fabricated reports. "You are finally going home to peace, Captain. Completely leave this messy war behind you," a senior commander told him firmly during their brief, highly sanitized farewell meeting. Miller simply nodded silently, heavily burdened by the horrific, undeniable truth. The massive military transport plane roared aggressively into the heavily overcast sky, forcefully carrying the deeply exhausted Australian soldiers away from the violent combat zone. Looking down through the small, scratched window at the rapidly shrinking green canopy of the deep jungle, Miller intimately knew that a crucial part of his fundamental soul remained permanently trapped in that muddy earth. The heavily traumatized young infantrymen sitting quietly around him stared blankly at the metal fuselage, completely stripped of their initial, highly romanticized youthful innocence. They were successfully escaping the physical battlefield, but the psychological war was just beginning. Returning to the vibrant, highly peaceful civilian life in Australia proved to be an incredibly jarring, deeply terrifying psychological experience for the heavily traumatized military intelligence officer. The incredibly clean, perfectly ordered suburban streets and the highly trivial, completely mundane daily concerns of his local community felt intensely alien and profoundly absurd. He desperately tried to seamlessly reintegrate into his old, familiar life, aggressively forcing himself to actively smile during pleasant, highly superficial family gatherings and friendly neighborhood barbecues. However, the deafening, horrific echoes of the brutal, deeply complex guerrilla conflict continuously shattered his fragile mental stability. Sleep absolutely refused to provide any comforting refuge for Captain Miller, actively transforming his quiet bedroom into a highly terrifying, deeply vivid theater of horrific combat nightmares. Every single night, the deeply agonizing screams of the violently tortured civilian prisoners and the incredibly loud, mechanical crack of heavy automatic weapons forcefully invaded his highly exhausted mind. He frequently woke up completely drenched in freezing sweat, his heart violently pounding against his chest as he desperately searched the dark, silent shadows of his quiet room for invisible enemy combatants. The deeply horrific, bloody secrets completely refused to stay buried. During a highly publicized, deeply patriotic military parade designed to heavily honor the returning task force veterans, Miller completely struggled to maintain his formal composure. The loud, incredibly rhythmic cheering of the enthusiastic civilian crowds and the highly festive, bright marching bands felt like a massive, deeply offensive mockery of the horrific, undeniable truth. We are incredibly proud of the absolute honor and immense bravery you actively demonstrated in the jungle, a smiling local politician stated proudly, aggressively shaking his trembling hand. Miller felt a profound, deeply sickening wave of severe nausea aggressively twist his tight stomach. He intimately knew that the highly celebrated, deeply sanitized official military narrative completely omitted the massive, highly tragic slaughter of entirely innocent, unarmed civilian refugees in the freezing mud. The profoundly disturbing, highly systemic torture practices actively utilized inside that terrifying, heavily isolated interrogation tent were completely erased from the clean, highly respected national history. The deeply corrupted military intelligence apparatus had successfully, entirely deceived the deeply trusting Australian public, actively painting a highly heroic, completely fabricated picture of a deeply unjust war. His heavy, highly decorated military medals felt like burning, incredibly toxic brands of profound shame. Desperate to completely numb the intense, agonizing psychological pain, Miller heavily turned to cheap alcohol, actively spending his incredibly long, deeply lonely evenings drinking himself into a dark stupor. The warm, amber liquid provided a brief, highly temporary escape from the terrifying, heavily vivid memories of the violently shattered bodies and the deeply desperate, heavily broken pleas of the tortured teenagers. He actively isolated himself from his deeply concerned family and highly confused former friends, completely unable to properly articulate the massive, horrific moral failures he had actively witnessed and silently facilitated. The deep trauma aggressively consumed him. Occasionally, he would accidentally encounter other heavily traumatized veterans who had actively served alongside him in the deeply contested, highly volatile Phuoc Tuy province. They would share deeply silent, highly knowing glances across crowded, noisy pubs, perfectly recognizing the profound, intensely heavy psychological darkness deeply etched into each other's exhausted eyes. They never actively discussed the horrific night ambush or the deeply terrifying, highly brutal interrogation sessions that had completely destroyed their fundamental human decency. The massive, deeply toxic burden of their shared, highly classified war crimes completely mandated an absolute, heavily unbreakable code of profoundly tragic silence. The highly controversial, deeply divisive Vietnam War eventually ground to a massive, highly chaotic conclusion, actively leaving behind a completely devastated, heavily scarred foreign landscape. However, the profound, heavily destructive psychological impact on the young, deeply exhausted Australian conscripts continued to aggressively manifest in incredibly high rates of severe depression and tragic suicide. The deeply corrupted, highly toxic military command structure absolutely refused to acknowledge the immense, highly damaging moral injuries actively inflicted upon their incredibly loyal, highly dedicated soldiers. The true, incredibly heavy cost of the brutal military intervention was entirely borne by the silently suffering veterans. Years later, sitting quietly in a deeply dusty, highly disorganized local library, Miller carefully read a newly published, highly acclaimed historical account of the regional Australian military deployment. The thick, heavily researched book actively relied upon the massive, deeply sanitized official intelligence archives, perfectly echoing the completely fabricated, highly heroic tactical narratives he had maliciously authored. The highly disciplined task force actively secured the civilian population and completely neutralized the heavy insurgent threat, the confident, highly respected historian falsely concluded in the final chapter. Miller slowly closed the heavy book, a deeply bitter, incredibly cynical tear falling. He finally realized that the absolute, deeply horrific truth regarding the bloody Phuoc Tuy province would completely die with him and his deeply traumatized, heavily silenced comrades. The massive, highly coordinated military propaganda machine had completely succeeded in permanently replacing the highly tragic, undeniable reality with a highly comforting, deeply fabricated national myth of honorable service. The deeply innocent, heavily terrified Vietnamese villagers who were violently murdered in the freezing mud had been completely, absolutely erased from existence by a stroke of his trembling pen. Their profound, incredibly tragic suffering absolutely demanded a deeply elusive, entirely impossible justice. The profound, highly agonizing realization that his deeply cowardly, completely silent complicity had actively enabled this massive, highly successful historical erasure completely broke his fragile, highly damaged spirit. He had originally joined the highly respected military forces to actively protect the incredibly vulnerable. Yet, he had ultimately become the precise, highly destructive bureaucratic instrument of their complete annihilation. The strict, highly idealized notions of absolute military integrity and profound personal honor were completely exposed as deeply fragile, highly dangerous illusions easily shattered by complex war. The dark, deeply terrifying secrets absolutely refused to grant him any lasting peace. The undeniable, deeply tragic reality of unconventional guerrilla warfare is that it absolutely guarantees the complete, highly systematic destruction of fundamental moral boundaries and essential human empathy. The highly aggressive, deeply paranoid Allied forces completely failed to recognize the immense, highly complex humanity of the deeply impoverished, heavily traumatized civilian population they were supposedly liberating. They actively chose to heavily rely upon overwhelming, completely indiscriminate violence and severe, highly brutal torture to forcefully achieve their deeply flawed, highly impossible strategic objectives. The entire, highly destructive military campaign was a profound, incredibly tragic failure of basic moral leadership. Captain Thomas Miller spent the remaining, deeply miserable years of his profoundly broken life actively haunted by the terrifying, highly vivid ghosts of the dark, incredibly humid jungle. He heavily carried the massive, deeply toxic weight of the horrific, undeniable atrocities completely alone, firmly locked inside a deeply terrifying, highly inescapable psychological prison of immense, agonizing guilt. The crisp, incredibly clean white paper that he had maliciously used to actively cover up the horrific massacre eventually became his ultimate, deeply terrifying psychological executioner. The deep, heavy silence of his horrific complicity was the absolute loudest, most deafening sound. There is absolutely no genuine, highly unblemished military glory to be actively found in the brutal, highly complex depths of an asymmetric, deeply controversial guerrilla conflict. The highly sanitized, completely fabricated, historical narratives can never truly wash away the incredibly dark, deeply metallic stains of innocent civilian blood actively spilled in the muddy rice paddies. The deeply tragic, highly terrifying legacy of the Australian military deployment in Vietnam is inextricably, completely linked to the profound, highly agonizing suffering of the local, heavily marginalized population. The completely undeniable, horrific truth stubbornly remains hidden beneath a massive mountain of lies. True, highly objective historical remembrance absolutely demands a completely unflinching, deeply honest reckoning with the horrific, highly uncomfortable dark side of violent military interventions and aggressive occupations. We must actively refuse to completely accept the highly sanitized, deeply fabricated official reports that aggressively attempt to cleanly mask the horrific, incredibly tragic realities of brutal warfare. The incredibly young, heavily traumatized soldiers and the deeply innocent, violently murdered civilians absolutely deserve to have their deeply horrific, highly tragic stories told with absolute, unyielding factual accuracy. The deeply comfortable, highly celebrated national myths must be aggressively, completely dismantled for truth. The deeply terrifying, highly bloody secret of the contested Phuoc Tuy province ultimately serves as a profound, incredibly dark cautionary tale regarding the absolute fragility of human morality. When highly stressed, completely terrified military forces are actively deployed into deeply complex, highly ambiguous combat environments, the incredibly thin veneer of civilized behavior rapidly and completely disintegrates. The highly systematic, deeply horrific dehumanization of the elusive enemy inevitably leads directly to the complete, highly tragic moral destruction of the supposedly righteous military liberators. The deep, incredibly agonizing echoes of this profound suffering will absolutely never completely fade away. As the old, deeply broken veteran slowly stared out his quiet window at the fading, highly peaceful evening light, he finally accepted his horrific, deeply tragic, permanent fate. The incredibly vivid, highly terrifying echoes of the violently tortured prisoners and the deeply innocent, heavily murdered civilian refugees would absolutely continue to aggressively torment his completely shattered soul. The incredibly dark, deeply bloody secrets of the horrific Vietnam War had successfully claimed his entire existence, actively leaving nothing behind but an immense, highly toxic void of pure regret. The profound, deeply agonizing tragedy was now completely, undeniably eternal. He quietly closed his deeply exhausted eyes, actively allowing the terrifying, highly vivid darkness of the humid tropical jungle to completely wash over his highly fragile, heavily damaged mind. He intimately knew that he could absolutely never escape the deeply horrific, highly toxic consequences of his massive, completely undeniable moral failures during the highly controversial, deeply destructive military conflict. The true, incredibly heavy cost of the brutal, highly aggressive military intervention was ultimately paid entirely with the deeply innocent blood of the victims and the completely shattered, profoundly tormented souls of the surviving veterans. The heavy silence remained,